I want to be honest with you before I start. I've told this story maybe 4 times in my life. Once to my commanding officer, who looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Once to my mother, who cried and then made me promise never to do it again. Once to a journalist who didn't believe me and didn't publish it. And once to a counselor at the Veterans Wellness Center on Station 12, who nodded slowly and then wrote something in her notes that she never showed me. This is the 5th time. And I'm telling it now because the council finally declassified the incident report last autumn, which means the parts I wasn't allowed to talk about before, I can talk about them now. The whole thing, start to finish. So let me start at the beginning. The year was 2387. I was 26 years old, stationed aboard the UES Meridian, which sounds impressive until you understand what the Meridian actually was. She wasn't a warship. She wasn't a flagship. She was a converted cargo hauler, roughly the size of 3 football stadiums stacked sideways, repurposed for medical and diplomatic transit between Earth and the outer convergence zones. We transported sick people, injured ambassadors, relief supply crates, and occasionally the kind of classified cargo that nobody was supposed to ask about. I was a corpsman, field medic, the kind of guy who showed up after things went wrong and tried to make sure people didn't die while the actual doctors figured out what to do. I was good at it. Not because I was brilliant or particularly brave, but because I had a calm face and steady hands, and in my experience, those 2 things are worth more than a medical degree when somebody's bleeding on the floor. The Meridian was 3 weeks out from Earth when we got diverted. I remember sitting in the crew mess eating something that was supposed to be chicken soup, but tasted like warm cardboard and salt water. Renaa was across from me, the ship's head nurse, reading something on her tablet. Chen was beside her, one of our biosystems engineers, arguing with himself about calibration logs. It was the kind of ordinary, boring evening that I would give a lot to have back now. Then the intercom clicked. All senior medical staff to Med Bay 1. This is not a drill. Renaa and I looked at each other. She put her tablet down very carefully, which told me she was worried. Renaa only moved carefully when she was worried. Any other time she was a hurricane. We walked fast through the corridor. The ship was humming, that particular hum it made when the gravity stabilizers were compensating for something. Not an alarm hum, just a working harder than usual hum. Med Bay 1 was the biggest we had. 12 beds, full surgical suite, 2 isolation chambers. When we got there, Captain Tells was already inside, standing with her arms crossed, talking to Dr. Osai in a low voice. They both looked up when we came in. "Close the door," Tells said. I closed it. "We received an emergency signal 40 minutes ago," she said. "From a Velhari transport ship. Designation Karath Sul, civilian vessel, deep humanitarian corridor. They have a critical patient on board. She needs blood." I waited. That didn't sound complicated. We had blood. We carried blood supplies the way other ships carried water, in bulk, refrigerated, cataloged by type. "What type?" Renaa asked. Tells and Osai exchanged a look. "That," said Osai, "is the complicated part. Here is what I knew about the Velhari before that night." Not much. Nobody did. They were one of the newer species to join the galactic convergence, admitted maybe 30 years before I was born. They came from a planet called Vethkaram, which sat at the edge of a binary star system so far out that the light from it hadn't reached Earth when the Egyptians were building pyramids. They were humanoid in the way that a lot of convergent species were humanoid. 2 legs, 2 arms, a head where a head was supposed to be. But the details were different. Their skin ran pale to silver-gray smooth with this faint luminescent quality in low light like moonstone. Their eyes were large and dark, no whites at all, just deep iris and pupil, and in the right light they caught and held brightness the way a cat's eyes did. Their hair tended toward black, fine, almost metallic in texture. And then there was the blood thing. The Velhari didn't photosynthesize. They didn't consume traditional solid food. Their biology ran on something closer to what our scientists called hemovoric processing. They metabolized trace compounds in blood, not the blood itself, the compounds. Specifically, they needed a particular cocktail of plasma proteins, enzymatic markers, and something our biologists never found a proper name for. We just called it the X factor because we were humans, and when we don't understand something, we label it and move on. Most convergent species had some version of the X factor in their blood. The Velhari had evolved to extract it from others, because Vethkaram had a specific atmospheric condition that meant producing it internally wasn't efficient. So over about 100,000 years, they developed a symbiotic feeding relationship with other life on their planet. Clean, painless, carefully regulated by their own biology so as not to harm the donor. When they joined the convergence, they came with their own synthesized blood packs from species across the galaxy. They didn't prey on anyone, hadn't for centuries. They had production facilities, they had agreements, they had very careful diplomatic protocols around the entire subject because they understood better than most how humans in particular would react to the word vampire. We didn't use that word in official documentation. We used hemovoric. Unofficially in the crew mess, away from the Velhari embassies and the diplomatic suites. Yeah, we said vampire. Not maliciously, just honestly. She's in hemovoric shock, Dr. Osai said. He pulled up the data the Karathsul had transmitted. It came up on the wall screen in columns of numbers and a medical readout I recognized as catastrophic. Her synthesized supply was contaminated. We don't know how yet, but it degraded in transit, possibly a seal failure in the refrigeration unit, possibly something else. She consumed it before the sensors flagged it. The degraded compounds triggered an immune cascade. She's been deteriorating for 18 hours. What does she need? I asked. Live blood, Osei said, not synthesized, live from a donor. The X factor degrades in synthetic processing. They've known that for a while, but the synthetic supply covers about 94% of what they need, enough that it works fine in normal conditions. But when a Velhari goes into hemovoric shock, the synthetic won't stabilize them. They need the real thing, direct. Silence in the room. What species? Rena asked. That's the problem, Tell said. She's already received emergency donations from 3 other Velhari on her transport. It helped, but not enough. Velhari to Velhari transfer works, but it's slow. They're all running low now. The ship has 2 Arak passengers. She paused. She can't tolerate Arak blood, severe incompatibility. What about human blood? I asked. Everyone looked at me. Osai clicked to another screen. Human blood is, theoretically, one of the most X-factor rich in the convergence. We've known this for about 15 years. It's one of the reasons Velhari diplomats frequently request assignments near human stations. They don't feed on anyone, obviously, but proximity to humans apparently has a kind of ambient beneficial effect we don't fully understand yet. He paused. A direct human blood transfer could stabilize her, theoretically. Theoretically, Tell said. In the tone of voice that meant she had serious reservations. It's never been done, Osai continued. Not in clinical conditions, not voluntarily. There are 2 documented cases of it happening under emergency circumstances, both during the early convergence wars, both involving captured or incapacitated individuals. Neither of those is useful precedent for anything except, don't do that. I looked at the screen, at the readouts, at the numbers. I'd been reading medical readouts since I was 19 years old. I knew what those numbers meant. She was dying, not slowly, not maybe. The trajectory was clear and it was going in one direction. How do we do it? I asked. Tells looked at me steadily. Voss, nobody is volunteering you for anything. I know, I'm asking how it works, mechanically. How do we do it if someone volunteers? Osai was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled up a different screen. Standard venous draw, maybe 200 to 300 milliliters, enough for a meaningful transfusion without significantly depleting the donor. The Velhari don't need volume, they need the compound content. We run it through a microfilter to remove any components that could cause a reaction on her end. Then he stopped. Actually, the hard part isn't the draw, the hard part is delivery. They need it, the compounds break down if it's not direct. It has to be administered the way they feed. Another silence. Which means, I said. Which means, Osai said, it can't go through a standard IV line. The heat exchange and the oxidation in the tubing kills the X factor in under 60 seconds. For the transfer to work, it needs to go directly. Her feeding apparatus makes contact with the donor's skin. That's the mechanism. I stood there and thought about what he was saying. She bites me, I said. Osai winced slightly. That's not the clinical language we'd use. But the mechanism is yes, essentially. Her biology does the rest. She doesn't need to drink large volumes, a small, controlled feeding interaction. Her anatomy handles the rest. I thought about it for maybe 10 seconds. Then I said, okay, let's go get her. The docking took about 40 minutes. The Carathsul pulled alongside us in the dark between stars. I watched through the porthole in Med Bay, a sleek ship, smaller than ours, elegant in the way Velhari design always was, all curved surfaces and soft light. They didn't like harsh angles. Their architecture tended to curves, like everything was designed to be held. I used those 40 minutes to make sure I understood what I was about to do. I signed a consent form, 3 pages long, dense with medical and legal language. Osai walked me through it. The relevant points were, I was doing this voluntarily. I understood the risks. The risks included but were not limited to feeding response escalation, which meant if the patient's hemovoric instincts took over, she might draw more than intended. And in rare cases with human donors, the X-factor transfer could cause a temporary neurological effect in the donor characterized by. The form used the word resonance, which Os translated as you might feel what she's feeling for a short period. Usually passes within hours. I signed it. Tells watched me with an expression I couldn't read. You don't have to do this, Voss. Captain, I said, she's dying, we can help. I'm going to help. Tells looked like she wanted to say something else. She didn't. They brought her over on a gurney. I was standing in the corner of Med Bay 1 when the airlock opened, and the medical team from the Carathsul came through. 2 Velhari medics in silver uniforms guiding the gurney, speaking to each other in that language that sounded like wind through glass, musical, soft, impossible to follow if you hadn't studied it, which I hadn't. Then I saw her. I don't know what I expected. Something scary, maybe, something that looked threatening given the context. Some creature from the dark edge of the imagination that matched all the old Earth stories. She looked like a person who was in terrible pain and trying not to show it. She was lying on the gurney with her eyes half open, those dark Velhari eyes catching the light of Med Bay. Her skin was gray, not the silver gray of health, but the flat gray of a sky before a storm, dull and wrong. Her hands were gripping the sides of the gurney, and I could see from across the room that they were shaking. Fine tremors, the kind that come from sustained biological distress. She was wearing a diplomatic uniform, dark blue, though it was disheveled now, the collar loosened. I'd learn later that she was a cultural attaché, traveling to the Convergence Station at Halo Point for a conference. Important enough that her ship had been in a humanitarian corridor. Young enough that the crisis had hit her harder than it might have hit someone older. She was probably my age. Maybe a year or two either side of 26. Dr. Osa went to speak with her medics. There was a translation unit running, a small device clipped to his lapel that handled the language gap. I stood back and waited. Then she turned her head and looked at me. I don't know why she looked at me specifically. Maybe she could already smell it, the X-factor, the thing she needed, something her senses could detect that mine couldn't. Maybe it was just coincidence. But she looked right at me from across the room with those dark, half-open eyes, and for a second something happened that I don't have a clinical explanation for. I wasn't afraid. I should have been. By any rational calculation, by every old inherited instinct, I should have felt something primal and alarmed looking at a creature whose biology was built to extract compounds from my bloodstream. But I didn't. I just felt sorry. She looked like she was in so much pain. She looked like she was trying very hard to hold herself together and doing it by sheer will. I walked toward the gurney. One of the Velhari medics stepped forward fast, putting a hand out, a warning not hostile but clear. The translation unit on Osai's lapel caught what the medic said and rendered it. The patient is in a destabilized hemovoric state. Do not approach without consent protocol. I stopped. Tell her, I said to Osai, that I'm the donor. Tell her I'm going to help. Osai spoke into his own translation unit. I watched her face while the words reached her. Her expression did something complicated. Her eyes opened a little more. And then, in a voice that came out rough and low and fractured at the edges, she said something in Velhari. The translation came a second later. You are human. Yes, I said. You understand what this involves? Yes. She looked at me for a long moment. Her hands tightened on the sides of the gurney. Then she said, why? I had to think about that for a second. Not because I didn't have an answer, because I wanted to give her the real one, not the easy one. Because you're in pain, I said, and I can fix it. That's what I do. The procedure took a while to set up because Osai was careful. He was careful in the way good doctors always are, not because he was scared, but because he wanted to do it right. He ran about 14 different scans on me first, making sure there was nothing in my bloodstream that could cause a reaction on her end, making sure I wasn't carrying anything that had even a theoretical risk of complication. He ran scans on her too, or had her medics do it, confirming that a human transfer was the right call and not going to make things worse. The Velhari medics were professional and quiet and deeply uncomfortable, not with me personally, with the situation. I could see it in the way they moved, precise, controlled, the way people move when they're in territory where they don't want to make a mistake. I sat in a chair beside the gurney. They adjusted it so I was at the right angle, so she'd be able to reach me without straining. They lowered the side of the gurney so there was nothing between us. Osa gave her a mild analgesic for the pain she was already in and a counteragent for the cascade reaction. Then he looked at me. "You understand the process," he said. It wasn't a question. "She feeds," I said. "Her biology takes what it needs. You monitor us both. If anything looks wrong, we stop." "If you want to stop at any point," he said, "say the word clear. Her medics have a separation protocol that will disengage her immediately. No hesitation, no harm to either of you." "Okay," I said. "Voss," he put a hand on my shoulder. "You're doing something very unusual. I want you to know I have a lot of respect for that." "Write it in the report," I said. "Maybe I'll get a commendation." He almost smiled, then he stepped back. She turned her head toward me from the gurney. Up close she looked worse. The pallor had a kind of blue-gray tinge to it now, and there were fine lines of strain around her eyes, the kind that muscles make when they've been held tense for too long. Her breathing was shallow. She said something. The translation unit rendered it softly. "I want to tell you my name before we do this. It is not something I would do anonymously." "What's your name?" I asked. "Sarath Vel." "You may use the short form if it is easier. Sarath." "Darian," I said. "Darian Voss." "Darian," she said it carefully, getting the sounds right. "I want you to know this is not something I do lightly. The feeding of a Velhari is personal. It is intimate in a way that is difficult to explain in translation. We do not do this with strangers." "I understand," I said, though I understood it more intellectually than emotionally at that moment. "I am asking your permission," she said. "Even now, even as I am like this, I am asking." Something tightened in my chest. There's a kind of dignity in that, you know? When you're suffering so badly that you're shaking and your skin has gone wrong and every biological system is fighting against you, and you still stop to ask permission. You still insist on the courtesy of it. "Yes," I said, "you have my permission, Sarath." She reached out and took my arm. Her hand was cool, not cold the way a corpse is cold, but the temperature of a room that hasn't been heated yet. Her fingers were careful, precise. She shifted forward on the gurney, and I felt the moment. The thing I don't have a proper word for, the moment when her feeding anatomy made contact with my inner wrist. It wasn't what I expected. I expected pain, sharp, immediate, the instinct to flinch. I braced for it. Instead, there was warmth. Not heat, warmth, like the feeling of stepping into sunlight after being inside too long, like the moment a headache starts to ease. Something in whatever she was doing, in the biological interaction, triggered a response in my nervous system that I would describe, if I had to, as relief. Like my body recognized something in her and decided it was all right. I heard Osa behind me make a small sound of scientific interest. He was watching his instruments. I watched Sarath. The change was fast is not quite the right word. Visible, that's the right word. It was visible. Within minutes, the flat gray of her skin began to shift, not dramatically, not all at once, but the dull, wrong quality started to leave it. There was something coming back, the faint luminescence, that quality I'd read about in the briefing files, that silver shimmer that Velhari had when they were well. Like watching a dying lamp begin to find its charge. Her grip on my arm relaxed from the tense hold it had been to something steadier. Her breathing changed, slower, deeper, more controlled. The fine tremors in her hands began to still. I watched it happen, and I thought, this is the most extraordinary thing I have ever seen. Not because it was beautiful, though in a clinical sort of way it was, but because it was direct in a way that medicine usually isn't. You give someone blood, and you don't see the red blood cells get to work. You give someone an antibiotic and you don't see it fighting the bacteria. But this I could see. Whatever she was taking from me was working in real time, right in front of me, the evidence written on her face and her skin and the steadying of her breath. I felt the resonance thing Ose had warned me about. It was subtle at first, just a kind of awareness, an emotional note that wasn't quite mine. Something like relief but deeper, something like surfacing from water after too long under. I understood in a non-verbal way that I can't fully translate into language what the recovery felt like from her side. It was extraordinary. The feeding lasted maybe 12 minutes. Osai was timing it. He had parameters set up he'd determined, based on her body weight and hemovoric rate, how much she'd need to stabilize without drawing more than I should comfortably give. When he said, "Sarath, that's the target mark," her medics were ready. She disengaged, carefully, deliberately. And then she sat back on the gurney, and I sat back in my chair, and we looked at each other for a moment in the quiet of Med Bay. She looked different, not entirely recovered, not in 12 minutes, but stabilized. The gray had moved back toward silver. Her eyes were fully open now, and they were alert, present. The pain lines around them were fading. I felt lighter than expected, honestly. I'd thought I'd feel weak. I did feel a little warm, a little woozy in the mildest possible way. But mostly what I felt was the tail end of that resonance, that echo of what she'd experienced, fading slowly now like the last note of a song. Osai was beside me immediately, scanning. "How are you feeling?" "Fine," I said, and I meant it. "Let me be the judge of that," he said, in his tone that brooked no argument. Sarath was speaking to her medics in Velhari, low voice controlled. Then she turned back to me. "Darian Voss," she said, "I owe you a debt." "You don't," I said. "I'm a medic. This is what I do." "There is no translation for what this is in your terms," she said. "But in Velhari understanding, you have given me life. That is not a thing that is forgotten." I didn't know what to say to that. I think I just nodded. They kept her in Med Bay overnight. Not because she was unstable. The transfer had worked. The cascade had reversed. And by the 3-hour mark, her readings were in the range Osai considered safe. They kept her because protocol demanded 24 hours of monitoring after any emergency hemovoric event, and because the Karath Sul needed to run diagnostic checks on its life support systems before she was safe to reboard anyway. I went to my bunk. I didn't sleep right away. I lay there in the dark of my small crew cabin, listening to the hum of the meridian, feeling the faint residual warmth of the resonance, and thought about what had just happened. I'd been involved in a first, not a small first, a medically significant first, the first voluntary, clinical, consented human-to-Velhari direct blood transfer in the history of the Convergence. Osai had said that quietly while debriefing me. He'd said it the way scientists say things they're very excited about but are trying to be calm about. I thought about her face, the way the pain had looked on it, and then the way it had started to ease, the deliberate courtesy of asking permission even when she was suffering that badly. I fell asleep thinking about it. Part 2, what she left by morning. I want to tell you what I found when I woke up. Before I do, I need to give you some context about the Velhari and the concept they call Velkarath. The word doesn't translate perfectly. The closest English approximation is something like gratitude bond or life debt acknowledgement. But those translations miss something important because in Velhari culture, Velkarath isn't a feeling or even a promise. It's a biological fact. Here is what I mean by that. When a Velhari feeds from someone, when they take the compounds they need to survive, their biology does something in response. It's not fully understood even now, even with all the research that followed. But the best explanation I've read goes something like this. The Velhari neurochemistry registers the donor as someone to whom a significant biological debt is owed, and it does something about that. Not symbolically, literally. Their endocrine system, their neurological mapping, their cellular memory, something in all of it shifts, subtly, permanently. The donor is remembered at a biological level. That's Velkarath. It's why, centuries ago on Vethkaram, the feeding relationship between Velhari and other species was sacred. It was why it was ritualized. Because the Velhari who fed from you didn't just take something, they were permanently altered by the interaction. You became part of their biological story. I didn't know any of this when I went to sleep that night. but it explains what I found in the morning. I woke up at 600 ship time, which was my normal schedule. I showered, got dressed, went to check on the patient before my shift officially started. Standard follow-up. I did it for everyone. Outside Med Bay 1, there was a Velhari medic I didn't recognize. Not one of the ones from the Karath Sul, this one was in different uniform markings. He looked at me when I approached and said something into a small communication device. "Can I help you?" I asked. "Korsman Voss," he said, in careful but fluent standard. "The cultural attaché asks if you are willing to speak with her before departure." "Sure," I said. He led me in. The med bay was quiet at that hour. Renaa was at the main station doing overnight logs. She glanced up when I came in and gave me a look I couldn't interpret, then went back to her work. Sarath was sitting up on the gurney, fully upright, her uniform straightened, her hair arranged. She looked, I want to be precise about this because it matters, she looked completely different from the night before. Not just healthier, something in her bearing had shifted. She carried herself with the kind of posture that spoke of someone who was used to being important, used to representing something, and had set all of that aside the night before and was now quietly putting it back on. There was a small package on the gurney beside her. She met my eyes when I came in. "Darian Voss," she said. Her voice was clear now, steady. "Sarath," I said, "you look a lot better." "I am significantly better," she said. "Dr. Osa indicates I can reboard within 2 hours pending final scans." A pause. "I asked to speak with you before departure because there are things that require being said in person." I pulled up a chair and sat down. "Okay." She looked at me for a moment with those dark eyes, and I had the sense of being assessed, not in a threatening way, but in the way of someone who was choosing words carefully. "What you did last night," she said, "is, in Velhari understanding, without a neutral framework. There is no just helping in our language for what this was. The feeding relationship, even in emergency circumstances, even between strangers, carries weight that does not exist in your human context for this kind of medical interaction." "I understand," I said, "or I'm starting to," Osai explained a little. "There is something I must tell you," she said. "It is something I would not have chosen to tell you necessarily, not because it is shameful or concerning, but because it is personal, and Velhari are not casual with personal information." She paused. "But you gave me something deeply personal, your blood, your X factor, which is more specific to you as an individual than you may know. It does not carry general human markers, it carries your markers. You, Darian Voss, specifically." I didn't say anything, I waited. "Because of what occurred between us," she said, "I am changed permanently in a specific way." She was choosing her words very carefully. "I am Velkarath to you. Do you know this term?" "I just learned it about an hour ago," I admitted. Something that might have been surprise moved across her face. "How?" "I couldn't sleep. I read everything I could find on Velhari biology in the ship's database." The thing that moved across her face resolved into something that I might call appreciation. "Then you understand what I am telling you." "Partly," I said. "I understand that it's biological, permanent, that you'll remember me at a cellular level, but I don't fully understand what that means in practice." She reached for the small package beside her. She held it for a moment without extending it toward me. "In practice," she said, "Velkarath traditionally carried obligations. A Velhari who had fed from a donor retained a sense of that donor's well-being, not precisely, not telepathically, but a general awareness. If the donor was in significant danger or distress, the Velkarath Velhari would know. Would feel it, would act." She paused. "This is why the feeding relationship was sacred, because it created a bond across species. The donor is protected, not because of a formal agreement, but because the Velhari's own biology insists upon it." I absorbed that quietly. "I am telling you this," she said, "because you should know, you gave me something. In return, regardless of your intention, regardless of whether you want it or not, you now have a Velhari who will know if you are in grave danger, who will have a very strong inclination to respond to that." She extended the package toward me. I took it. It was small, maybe the size of a thick book, wrapped in material I didn't recognize, dark, slightly iridescent, like fabric woven from something that caught light differently than cloth should. "Open it when I am gone," she said. Not because there is anything secretive about the contents, but because Velhari custom around Velkarath gifts is that the giver should not watch the receiving. It is intimate in a direction that would be uncomfortable for both of us, I think. Okay, I said. She looked at me for a moment. You are very calm, she said. Most humans, I believe, would be more reactive to this information. I thought about that. I gave you my blood last night and let you feed from me. I signed a consent form that included neurological resonance as a risk. I think I'm past the point of getting reactive about the concept of a biological bond with a Velhari. She held my gaze for 3 long seconds. Then she did something I hadn't seen her do once, not the night before when she was suffering, not this morning when she was careful and formal. She smiled. It was small, brief, but it was real. You are unusual, Darian Voss, she said, for a human or otherwise. She departed at 9:23 ship time. I stood in the observation alcove and watched the Karathsul ease away from us, its curved silver hull catching starlight, moving with that fluid elegance that Velhari ships always had. Getting smaller, disappearing into the dark. Then I went to the empty storage room next to Medbay, somewhere quiet and private, and I opened the package. Inside was a communication crystal, which was standard Velhari technology, a small ovoid device, silver-white smooth, the equivalent of a contact code. If I pressed and held it, it would send a signal to its matched crystal, hers. There was also a data chip, which I plugged into my tablet. It contained a document in both Velhari and standard, a formal Velkarath acknowledgement, apparently traditional, which outlined in careful language what the bond entailed from her side, and what, if anything, I should understand about it. It was dense with language that felt almost legal in its precision, like a contract of obligations. But it wasn't the crystal or the data chip that stopped me. It was the third thing. A handwritten note. On actual paper, not paper exactly, some Velhari equivalent, thin and slightly luminous. Written in standard, in careful, even letters, like someone who had learned the script and practiced it until it was right. It said, Darian, I do not know if this is how humans write informal messages. I apologize if the form is wrong. I do not do this often. There is something beyond the Velkarath that I wish to tell you. My people have a belief, not a superstition. We are a scientific people, but a belief that persists in our culture because we have no better language for the observation, that the X factor is not identical in every human, that it carries something of who the person is. Their particular essence, perhaps. We have no precise word. I do not know you. You are a stranger I met in a crisis, but the interaction last night told me something because the X factor carries something. What I received from you, what I carry now in my biological memory, is curious. It is brave in a very quiet way. It is calm. It is the kind of calm that is not absence of feeling but deliberate management of it. I do not know if this describes you accurately, but it describes what came through. I am glad you are the one who helped me. I have a great deal of work ahead of me. The conference at Halo Point, the diplomatic sessions, the long work of building something between our peoples that is more than formal agreements. But I want you to know, wherever your posting takes you, that there is a Velhari who knows your name, who will know if you are ever in genuine danger, who will come if she can. That is not nothing. Sarath Vel, Cultural Attaché, Third Convergence. P.S. The crystal is matched to mine. You do not have to use it, but if you want to speak, I think I would like to know how the rest of your story goes. I sat in that storage room for a long time. I'm not going to pretend I was unmoved. I'd like to claim I took it in with my characteristic calm, the one she'd apparently detected in my X factor, and just filed it away rationally. But that would be a lie. I sat there reading that note twice and then a third time, and I felt something that I'm still not entirely sure how to name. Not romantic love. I want to be clear about that because I know how this kind of story sounds and I know the shape people expect it to take. We weren't that. She was a Velhari diplomat and I was a human corpsman, and we'd known each other for approximately 8 hours, most of which she'd spent in medical distress. What I felt was significance, the weight of something that had happened that couldn't unhappen. A thread, thin but real, stretched between me and a being who was now moving away through the dark between stars, carrying something of me in her biology that she'd carry for the rest of her very long Velhari life. There is a word for that, maybe. I haven't found it yet. Life on a medical ship doesn't stop for personal epiphanies. The Meridian had its schedule and its patience, and its 200 crew members who needed feeding and medical support, and all the ordinary apparatus of daily existence. I went back to work. I thought about Sarath, not obsessively, not constantly, but she was there in the way that significant things are there, present in the background of normal life. I told almost no one, partly because of the classification on the incident, partly because I didn't have language for it yet. I didn't use the crystal right away. I held it sometimes in the evenings, that small silver-white ovoid, warm in the hand in a way that seemed slightly beyond the ambient temperature of my cabin. I'd read everything the ship's database had on Velhari biology, on Velkarath, on the X-Factor research. The academic papers were dense and careful and hedging, and I read between the lines of all of them for what they couldn't quite say. 3 months after the incident, I pressed the crystal. It took about 40 seconds. Then there was a sound, not a call signal exactly, more like a tone. And then her voice, clear despite the distance, in careful standard. "Darian Voss, I wondered when you would." "I wanted to wait until I had something worth saying," I said. "And do you?" "Not really, I just wanted to know if it worked." A pause, then "It works." We talked for maybe 20 minutes about nothing in particular. How the conference at Halo Point had gone. My current posting, the food on her ship versus the food on mine. Small things, easy things. The kind of things you talk about when you're both figuring out how a new form of communication works between people who are technically strangers, with a very unusual connection. I called the crystal again 2 weeks later, and then a week after that. And then it became a regular thing, irregular in scheduling, because our lives and postings didn't allow regularity, but consistent in the sense that it happened and kept happening. I learned things about her. She was younger than she'd seemed in her professional capacity, about the Velhari equivalent of late 20s in human terms, which translated to roughly 40 of our years. She'd been fast-tracked into diplomacy because of her language aptitude and her ability to hold very still in situations where other people couldn't. She had a dry, precise sense of humor that emerged in the gap between formal sentences. She had opinions about human architecture that she'd clearly been holding back in diplomatic settings and was willing to express to me with surprising frankness. She found human food philosophically baffling. "You consume such large volumes," she said once. "It is inefficient." I told her I found the concept of getting all your nutrition from compounds in blood philosophically baffling and probably inefficient in its own way. She considered this for a while and then said she supposed we were even. She told me eventually more about Velkarath, about what she actually experienced from her side of it. She was careful with the words, always Velhari were careful people, but the picture emerged gradually, a low, constant sense of something that she could only describe as presence, like knowing there was a light source somewhere in a dark room even if you couldn't see it directly. Not intrusive, not overwhelming, just there. "Does it bother you?" I asked once. "No," she said. "It would bother me if it was gone." A year and a half after the incident on the Meridian, I was reassigned. The United Earth Medical Corps had a policy of rotating field corpsmen through different postings to prevent both stagnation and burnout. I'd been on the Meridian for 3 years. My rotation took me to Halo Point Station itself, the convergence hub where Sarath had been heading that night when her transport was diverted. Halo Point was enormous. The kind of enormous that takes your breath away the first time you see it through an approach window. A ring station the size of a small moon, rotating slowly in the dark between systems, lit from within like a captured city, trailing its docking arms like the legs of some vast creature resting in space. Approximately 200,000 beings of various species lived and worked there permanently. Another 50,000 or so passed through at any given time. The Earth Diplomatic and Medical Annex was in Section 7 of the Inner Ring, a cluster of interconnected modules designed to make humans comfortable while also being navigable for species with different environmental needs. It was my job to support the human personnel and occasionally assist with cross-species medical emergencies. I told Sarath I was being posted to Halo Point. There was a pause on the crystal, longer than usual. "I have a conference there in 4 months," she said. "I know," I said. "You mentioned it." Another pause. "I was not sure if you would want." "Sarath," I said, After everything, yes, I would want. I want to tell you what it was like to meet her in person again. Not the medical emergency context. Not the med bay with its equipment and its professional atmosphere and the weight of crisis in the air. Just two people who'd been talking across the dark between stars for a year and a half, meeting in a corridor of Halo Point Station with conference badges and normal clothes. She was exactly as I'd seen her in my memory, which surprised me. I think I'd expected something different. The mind does things to memories over time, fills them with resonances and meanings that weren't there in the original moment. I thought I'd built her up in ways that wouldn't match reality. She walked toward me down the corridor of the Convergence wing, and she looked precisely like herself. Silver-gray skin, luminescent in the ambient light of the station. Dark eyes. That particular Velhari stillness in the way she moved, controlled and deliberate. In the diplomatic uniform of her office, different colors now, a more senior grade than she'd been wearing before. She stopped about 2 feet from me, and we looked at each other. Then she said in perfect standard, "Your hair is longer." "It's been 18 months, I said. "Yes, a pause, you look well." "You look significantly better than the last time I saw you in person," I said. Something moved in her expression, the precursor to that small, brief, real smile. "That is not a high bar." "No," I agreed, "but you clear it easily." We had dinner together. Velhari don't share meals in the conventional sense. She didn't eat what I ate, but we sat in a restaurant in the Convergence wing that catered to mixed-species social dining, where the tables were designed for exactly this situation. I had something that resembled a good pasta. She had what looked like a crystal glass of dark liquid, and was in fact a synthesized nutritional compound that she drank in small, considered sips. We talked for 4 hours. I won't try to reproduce the whole conversation. It ranged widely, from her current diplomatic work to the state of relations between Earth and the outer convergence to the research that had followed the incident on the Meridian OSA had published, with my permission, and with the incident classification status at the time, a partially redacted medical paper that had caused considerable academic interest. We talked about the Velkarath, how it had settled, how she experienced it now that I was physically present on the same station. "It is different," she said. "When you are close, the sense I described, the distant light, it is no longer distant. It is present, specific." She considered her words. "It is like the difference between knowing abstractly that the sun exists and standing in sunlight." I thought about that. Is that comfortable or uncomfortable? "It is honest," she said. "It is precisely what it is, neither comfortable nor uncomfortable, just accurate." I told her about the resonance I'd felt that night in Med Bay, the echo of her relief, fading like a song's last note. She was very interested in this. It fit with some of the research she'd read, the suggestion that the transfer wasn't entirely one-directional, that the X-factor interaction could create a transient neurological bridge that moved both ways. "Do you still feel anything?" she asked. "From your side, any residual?" I thought about it honestly. "Sometimes," I said. "It's not specific, it's not I can't tell what you're feeling or anything like that. But occasionally, since that night, I have moments where I feel something that doesn't quite belong to me. Something calmer than I am, more certain, settled." I paused. "I don't know if that's real or if I'm projecting." She looked at me for a long time. "It may be real," she said. "Our biologists would not commit to a conclusion, but the theory is that the Velkarath creates a form of echo, not identical in both directions, but not entirely absent either." "So we both carry something," I said. "Yes." I let that sit between us for a moment. "Is this strange for you?" I asked. "Meeting a human, this kind of meeting, not diplomatic, not professional." "Everything about what has developed between us," she said carefully, "is outside my previous experience. The Velkarath itself is not unusual. Velhari acquire it in emergencies sometimes, unavoidably. But the Velkarath partner being someone who then talks to you, who reads everything in the ship's database, who asks good questions, who calls the crystal at 3 months and says he had nothing worth saying but called anyway." She paused. "That," she said, "is unusual." She was at Halo Point for 3 weeks. We met every 2 or 3 days. Never for long. She had a conference schedule that was genuinely grueling, and I had shifts, and neither of us was the kind of person who abandoned their work for social preference. But we made space. We walked the outer observation corridors at the end of long days, watching the stars and the traffic of ships. We found a small human tea shop in Section 7 that she found architecturally impractical, but was willing to endure because the ambient sound was pleasant. We talked about everything. I am going to be honest with you, I was falling for her. Not in the desperate, overwhelming way of people who don't know themselves. In the quiet way of someone who has noticed something clear and true and is still in the process of understanding what to do with it. She was remarkable. Her intelligence was of a kind I hadn't encountered before, precise and patient, capable of holding a complicated thing still in her mind and turning it slowly until she understood it from every angle. She was careful in a way that was not coldness, but consideration. She was still capable of surprising me, which at that point in my life was not something many people managed. And there was the Velcarath, the biological fact of it underneath everything else. The knowledge that I was known by her at a level that had nothing to do with choice or history or learned familiarity, that something in my blood had told her something about me, and she'd carried it for over a year before we ever exchanged a voluntary word. That's a strange thing to carry, the knowledge of being known that way. But it didn't feel wrong. That's what I kept coming back to. For something as strange as our situation was, by any human framework, by every cultural and species difference, it felt right in the way that things feel right when they're true. On her last evening at Halo Point, we stood in the observation corridor and watched a Velhari cargo ship come in to dock. She was leaving the next morning on a diplomatic transport. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and you may decline without it changing anything between us." "Okay," I said. "The Velcarath," she said. "It is, as I have explained, permanent from my side. What I carry, that is not something I chose or can change. But from your side, you have a choice. You can treat this as what it was, a medical intervention during an emergency, the natural consequences of which were unexpected and interesting, and which you engage with as a correspondence between interesting people from different species. There is no obligation beyond that." She paused. "Or," she said, "you can understand it as the beginning of something that does not have a name yet, in either of our languages, because neither of our peoples has made this particular path before." I looked at the docking ship, at the stars beyond it, at the vast and ordinary miracle of the convergence, all these different forms of life finding ways to exist alongside each other. "Sarath," I said, "I pressed that crystal when I had nothing worth saying. I've read everything your people have published about Velcarath in the last 18 months. I flew to a conference I was not invited to on my personal leave time." A pause. "You did not mention that," she said. I was being subtle. She looked at me. That thing moved in her expression, the precursor to the small, real smile. But this time the smile came and it didn't go quickly. It stayed. "You are very bad at subtle," she said. "Apparently," I agreed. "But I mean it. I don't know what we're doing exactly. I don't know if there's a word for it in either language, but I know I'd like to keep doing it, for as long as it makes sense." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "In Old Velhari there is a phrase, Velcarath ar Sarathmun. It has no direct translation. Approximately. The bond made real by choice, not only by blood. It was traditionally used when a Velcarath relationship was acknowledged formally, when the donor understood what had happened and chose to engage with it rather than setting it aside." She paused. "It is very old language. We do not use it often. It was thought to be historically specific, related to an older form of our society." She looked at me. "I find myself thinking it applies here. I am going to skip forward now, not because nothing happened between that evening and the present, a great deal happened, but because this document is a witness testimony, not a comprehensive biography, and I want to get to the part that the council asked me to speak to, the part they wanted on record. The short version of what happened in the years between. We maintained contact, regular across the crystal. She continued her diplomatic work, rising, as it turned out, fairly fast through the Velhari diplomatic corps, which seemed to have taken note of her facility with human communication. I continued my medical work, taking postings that allowed reasonable access to the communication network that supported the crystals. We met in person 4 more times over 3 years, at convergence hubs that overlapped with both our schedules. Each time felt like a continuation, not a reunion. The thread was always there, So what we were doing when we met in person was just changing the quality of it, not re-establishing it. Year 3, I applied for a posting to the Earth-Velhari Liaison Medical Unit, which had been established partly in response to the research that came out of the Meridian incident. Osai's paper, once it was fully declassified, had generated significant interest in the medical communities of both species. The liaison unit was specifically designed to handle cross-species medical interactions, particularly involving Velhari. I got the posting. It meant working on Vethkaram. Not in any permanent settlement, I was based on the orbital station above the planet, the one that handled convergence traffic, but close enough. Close enough to Sarath, who had been recalled to Vethkaram for a senior diplomatic appointment. Part 4, THE Crisis, and what came of it. I need to tell you about the 7th convergence incident. That's what the official reports called it. What most people who lived through it called it was something considerably less polite. Year 4 of my posting on the Vethkaram orbital station. A faction within the Galactic Council. Not Velhari, not human, but a third species whose name I'm going to keep out of this document for reasons I'll explain shortly, attempted to destabilize the Earth-Velhari treaty framework that had been in careful construction for 6 years. They did it by releasing falsified medical data. Specifically, a document that claimed the X-factor transfer, the process that had saved Sarath's life, and which the Liaison Medical Unit had been studying and developing into a legitimate cross-species medical protocol, was being used as cover for covert Velhari infiltration of human neural systems. The claim was that the Velkarath bond was not a natural biological response, but a deliberate mechanism for controlling or monitoring human minds. It was entirely fabricated. I know this because I spent 4 years in the medical research that proved otherwise. But it was well-crafted fabrication, and it hit at exactly the anxieties that the long work of diplomacy had been carefully managing. All the old human fears about the Velhari, all the old Earth paranoia about being infiltrated or controlled, all the ways in which the word vampire had weight that the word hemuvoric didn't. Within 3 days of the document's release, there were protests on 2 human stations. Within a week, there were calls in the Earth Parliament for suspension of the treaty. Within 2 weeks, there were incidents, minor, but real, against Velhari diplomatic personnel in several locations. And in the middle of all of it, there was Sarath, who was one of the most recognizable faces of the Earth Velhari diplomatic work, and who had been named in the falsified document specifically. Her name attached to a claim about human subjects in an unauthorized Velkarath manipulation program. She was targeted, I'm saying it plainly, not by violence initially, by information. Her name, her image, her position, everything public about her, deployed in a campaign designed to make her look like the architect of something she hadn't done. I found out when she didn't respond to the crystal for 6 days. 6 days, that hadn't happened in 4 years. Even during demanding conference periods, she'd always managed at least a brief signal. On day 7, the crystal activated on its own. She'd initiated the call, not me, and her voice came through quieter than usual and very controlled. I need to tell you what is happening, she said, before you hear it from another source. She told me about the document. She told me what was being said about her. She told me in the same careful, considered language she used for everything, but I could hear underneath it, not in the Velkarath sense, but in the ordinary sense of knowing someone the strain of it. 4 years of careful work, her reputation, her people's diplomatic progress, being used as the face of a fabricated crisis. She was not asking for help, I want to be clear. She was informing me, because she thought I deserved to know directly, not second-hand. I said, what do you need? I need people to listen, she said. To the science, to what the Liaison Medical Unit has documented. There are people who will dismiss it because it comes from Velhari sources, but a human saying the same things. I'll testify, I said immediately. A pause. Darien, the political climate right now, a human publicly defending. I'll testify, I said again, in front of whoever needs to hear it. The Convergence Council, the Earth Parliament, anybody. I have 4 years of medical data. I have first-hand experience of the Velkarath from the donor side. I have a signed consent form and complete medical records and the original incident report from the Meridian. If they want the truth about what the X-factor transfer is, and what the Velkarath bond is and what it isn't, I can give it to them. Another pause, longer this time. You would be associated publicly, she said carefully, with a Velhari who is currently the subject of a diplomatic crisis. With me specifically. Sarath, I said, do you remember what I told you when you asked why I was going to help you that first night, on the Meridian? You said a pause, because you were in pain and I could fix it, that is what you do. Still true, I said. The silence on the crystal lasted about 10 seconds. When she spoke again, her voice was very even. I do not have a word, she said, for what you are to me, Darien, not in standard. Not quite in Velhari, even. We'll find one, I said. Later, right now tell me who to call. What followed was about 3 months of the most exhausting, most important work of my professional life. I testified before the Convergence Medical Council in person, on the orbital station, with a delegation of human scientists and Velhari researchers, presenting the complete documented history of the liaison unit's research into X-factor transfer. The science was clear. The Velkarath bond is a biological response, fully documented, fully understood within its current research scope. It doesn't allow for control. It doesn't allow for monitoring in any targeted sense. It creates a bond of awareness, a sense of another's gross well-being that is not directional, not invasive, not manipulable. More importantly, the donor's mind is not affected, not altered, not influenced beyond the brief resonance period immediately following transfer, which is temporary and well-documented. I spoke to this from personal experience, under oath, in front of a council that was taking notes. I wasn't the only voice, but I was one of the ones they listened to, because I was human, because I had the original incident report, because I'd been the first voluntary clinical donor on record, and I was standing there, 4 years later, clearly fine, clearly unaffected, clearly not controlled by anyone. I also, at the request of the Council's communication team, gave a brief public statement. Not a press conference, a recorded statement, released through official channels, about 3 minutes long, about what the X-factor transfer had been and what the Velkarath was and what my experience had actually consisted of. I told the truth, all of it including the parts that were personal, including Sarath's name, including the crystal, including the 4 years of calls and conversations and meetings across the Convergence. I thought, honestly, that it might cost me my career. Human medical personnel publicly acknowledging a personal relationship with a Velhari diplomat, in the middle of a diplomatic crisis, specifically targeting that diplomat. It was not exactly a career-optimizing choice. What happened instead surprised me. The response from ordinary humans who weren't invested in the political machinery of the crisis, from regular people on Earth and the stations who read the statement or watched the clip, was overwhelmingly supportive. Not universally. There were people who called me compromised, who called me a pawn, who used language I won't repeat here. But the majority response was something I hadn't anticipated. People were moved by it, by the original story, by the image of a human corpsman on a medical ship in the dark between stars opening a vein for a dying stranger because it was the right thing to do, by the biological bond that followed and what it had grown into over 4 years. One journalist called it the most genuinely human story to come out of the Convergence crisis. I thought about that for a long time. I still think about it. Because I'm not sure the journalist understood what they were saying, that the most human story was about a human doing something for someone who wasn't human, and finding something extraordinary on the other side of that. But maybe that's exactly what it means to be human. Maybe the whole argument, the one this community of HFY storytellers keeps making, has always been making, in 100 different stories about 100 different encounters. Maybe it's not that humans are strong or fast or powerful. Maybe it's that humans look at a stranger in pain and think I can fix that and do it without requiring a reason beyond the fact that they can. The crisis resolved. The falsified document was traced back and dismantled. The faction responsible was censured by the Council. The treaty framework held was, in fact, strengthened by the process of defending it. Sarath was cleared, formally, publicly, with the kind of institutional vindication that matters precisely because the accusation had been institutional. She called the crystal that evening, the evening the clearance was announced. I was in my quarters on the orbital station, trying to wind down after 3 months of testimony and meetings and political navigation that had taken years off my life expectancy. I was fairly certain. "It is done," she said. Yes, I said, how are you? A pause, tired, she said, which was for Sarath a significant admission. Grateful. You would have survived it without me, I said. Probably, she said, but you made it shorter, less costly. A pause. You said my name publicly in the middle of it. Yes. You understood what that meant, the association. Yes. You did it anyway. Yes. A long silence, the kind of silence that has weight to it, not empty but full. Darian, she said, I want to ask you something you do not have to answer tonight. You can think about it. Ask, I said. There is a formal recognition in Velhari culture, she said carefully, for what we are, what we have been these 4 years. It does not translate directly to human relationship frameworks. It is not precisely what your culture calls marriage. It is not precisely what we call bonding. It is something older, specific to Velkarath situations, where both parties have acknowledged the bond and chosen to honor it with continued intention. She paused. It is called Velmarin. It means approximately the bond walked forward together. It would require formal acknowledgement from both sides, a ceremony of a kind, very simple by Velhari standards. We do not do elaborate ceremony, but meaningful. I sat with that for a moment. Would it require me to be on Vethkaram? I asked. For the ceremony, yes, briefly. Okay, I said. You have not thought about it, she said. I told you to think about it. Sarath, I said. I pressed a communication crystal at 3 months when I had nothing to say. I testified before the Convergence Council. I called you I paused, finding the word. My Velkarath partner in a public statement in the middle of a political crisis. I think my answer is available. Very quiet. Yes, she said, I suppose it is. That small, real smile was audible in her voice, even across the dark between stars. This is the last section of my testimony. The council asked me to speak to the significance of the incident in the context of human Velhari relations from my personal perspective. I'm going to try. I am 38 years old. I have been partnered to Sarath Vel, cultural attaché, and now senior diplomatic director of the Earth Velhari liaison, for 6 years by human reckoning. We divide our time between the Vethkaram orbital station and the Earth diplomatic annex on Halo Point, depending on where the work is. It is not a conventional life. I'm not sure I've ever wanted a conventional life. The Velkarath is still there from her side. She says it has deepened over time, that the sense of presence has become more specific, more nuanced. She can tell, she says, the difference between me being physically tired and emotionally troubled, though she can't tell which emotion specifically, just the quality of it. I find this both fascinating and occasionally inconvenient. From my side, I still have those moments. The sense of something calmer than me, more settled, more certain. Usually when I'm stressed and it shows up like a hand on the shoulder. I can't prove it's real. The research still hedges on whether it's a genuine residual effect or a psychological response shaped by knowing about the Velkarath. But I'll tell you what, when I'm in a difficult situation and that calmness arrives, I don't care very much about the mechanism. It does what it does. People ask me sometimes, usually junior members of the liaison medical unit, usually young, usually just learning the biology, they ask me if I was scared that night on the Meridian, when I agreed to do it. The honest answer is no. I've already told you that I wasn't scared. But here's what I've understood, looking back from 12 years away. I should have been, by any rational calculation. The informed consent form alone was 3 pages of things that could go wrong. I knew essentially nothing about Velhari biology in any practical sense. I was 26 years old, and I was in a medical bay in the middle of the dark between stars, and there was a creature whose biology was built to extract compounds from my blood, and I said yes without much hesitation. Why? I've thought about this for 12 years and I still come back to the same answer. It wasn't bravery, not exactly. It wasn't a calculated risk assessment. It was simpler than that. It was, she was suffering, I could help, so I would help. The species difference, the biological strangeness, the fear I probably should have felt, none of it outweighed the basic clarity of the situation. She needed something I had it, I gave it. And in giving it, I got something back that has defined the last 12 years of my life. I think that's what people mean when they talk about what humans are. Not that we're strong or fast or technologically advanced. We're mediocre on all those scales by convergent standards. There are species in the convergence that have been spacefaring for longer than humanity has had written language. There are species with biological advantages that make us look fragile as paper. But there's something in us, in the best of us at least, that doesn't stop to calculate the return before it acts. That sees suffering and moves toward it rather than away. That crosses species lines and cultural lines and fear lines because the math of compassion is simple. Someone is hurting, I can help, so I will. That's the thing the Velhari couldn't synthesize. Not the X factor, they can get close to that in a lab. The other thing. The thing that made me sit down next to a dying stranger and give her what she needed without asking for anything back. The fact that I got something back was a grace, an unexpected one, the best kind. The council asked me also to speak to the significance for Velhari human medical relations specifically. The short version, the Liaison Medical Unit's research built on the original Meridian incident has now produced a comprehensive protocol for voluntary X-factor transfer in emergency hemovoric situations. Clean, consented, safe, tested across dozens of clinical interactions. A genuine achievement of cross-species medicine. There are now 12 human voluntary donors registered with the Velhari Medical Authority, people who have chosen to be available for emergency transfers in medical facilities near Velhari populations. Each of them went through careful preparation, comprehensive informed consent processes, and psychological evaluation. Each of them, independently, when asked why they volunteered, gave answers that were variations on the same theme. She was suffering, I could help. So I would. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think it's a fact about humans that we ought to be proud of. We are made of something the galaxy needed and didn't know to ask for. Let me end with this. The night of the incident on the Meridian, the night I gave Sereth my blood, the night she fed from my wrist and the gray wrong quality left her skin, and she came back to herself in Med Bay 1 while the stars went past outside. That night, lying in my bunk afterward, I felt the resonance fading. It was like the last note of a song. I've used that image before. I keep coming back to it because it's the most accurate one I have. But here's what I didn't say before, because I didn't understand it yet. When a song ends, what you're left with isn't silence. You're left with the memory of it, the way it hung in the air, the particular note it chose to close on. And that memory has a quality that the song itself didn't quite have, because now you know how it ends and you can hear the whole thing at once. The resonance faded that night, but it didn't fully leave. 12 years later, I still have moments. That particular settled calm that doesn't quite belong to me. That sense of presence somewhere in the architecture of myself that I didn't put there. I can't explain it in clinical terms, and the researchers are still arguing about what it means. But I know what it is. It's what happens when you give something real and get something real back. When an act of ordinary human decency, just I can help, so I will, crosses a boundary nobody had crossed before and comes back with something unexpected. Something that doesn't have a name in any language yet.